It might come to us as a shock that in the last couple of decades, there has been a rising doubt about the very existence of Jesus. Though mostly an internet phenomenon found in blogs and atheist websites, this challenge has come to public notice with widely spread documentaries like Zeitgeist and Bill Maher's Religulous, plus the activity of people such as Robert Price and Richard Carrier. This doubt about the historical existence of Jesus of Nazareth is called Mythicism, or more specifically, Jesus Mythicism. Though there are various strains of this view, the fundamental claim is that Jesus of Nazareth never existed. According to these authors, he is a cleverly invented myth that has been subsequently turned into a historical figure by the early church. This issue is of paramount importance for us as Christians. It strikes at our very name. If you can prove that Jesus doesn't even exist, then paraphrasing Paul, vain is our faith and we are the most pitiable of men. Christianity has always seen itself as a historical religion, based in a historical Jesus who was born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried, and on the third day he rose again from the dead. The very mention of Pontius Pilate in the Creed grounds us in the history of the first century Palestine. If we don't believe in a mythological Jesus who existed in an illo tempore right along Hercules and Horus, this means that Christianity is, using Popper's term, falsifiable. However, as Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI puts it, if we believe that Christ is real history and not myth, then the testimony concerning him has to be historically accessible as well. Hence the task for this video. Before any of you start to get concerned, it is important to realize that the question of Jesus' historical existence is not something doubted in professional academia. Catholic apologist Trent Horn states that there is no serious debate among the vast majority of scholars in the fields related to the question of the existence of Jesus. Even the extremely skeptic atheist and Bible scholar Bart Ehrman says in his book, Did Jesus Exist? The view that Jesus existed is held by virtually every expert on the planet. It truly is a fringe theory. However, appeal to the vast majority of scholars is not enough to show the truth of the statement. We will need to do some historical digging and analysis to get to the bottom of this question. History is traditionally said to be based on two sources, documenta et monumenta, documents and monuments. In this video, we will be focusing on the documents, although there are some very interesting arguments to be made based on several archaeological places in the Holy Land, such as the Holy Sepulchre. We will first consider the arguments made for mythicism and against the historical Jesus, namely the various mythicist proposals and the famous argument from silence. Once we have dealt with the naysayers, we will then examine the best documental evidence for Christ's historical existence in early non-Christian sources, Tacitus and Josephus, followed up by the earliest Christian source, St. Paul. It's important to realize that each of these topics could merit many hours of discussion, looking into all the objections and counter-objections. One just has to watch a debate or two to see how in the weeds you can go. I'll limit myself to the main points and main objections to condense it down so that you can get a general feel for the field. In the end, I will give you an array of sources so that you can go in depth and fill out where I have not been able to go in this video. Okay, let's jump in. The arguments for mythicism and their critique. First, it is important to see why those who deny Christ's existence feel the need to propose him as a myth. The reason is that basically, if Christ wasn't a real person in history, you still have to explain Christianity. Someone must have founded this religion and come up with a story or myth of Jesus Christ. As we will find out, there have been many different proposals for the mythical Jesus. So first we will give some background and explain the different proposals and show how they fall apart. Then we will answer the second mythicist objection, namely the argument from silence, or that no contemporary author wrote about Jesus. According to the scholar Van Voorst, the argument that Jesus never existed but was invented by the Christian movement around the year 100 goes back to Enlightenment times, when the historical critical study of the past was born. It has gone through many phases and authors throughout its history since then. Generally, the proposals for mythicism try to show that the Jesus story isn't original, but a copycat. They find ancient myths that seem to have, in their eyes, a strange likeness to Christ, and then, after pointing out the supposed parallelism, conclude that Christ is only a repackaged ancient myth like Horus or Mithra. The problem with these arguments is that they have been quite seriously debunked by serious scholars, and many times rely on not up-to-date research on ancient myths and cultures. The first thing to say is that parallelism doesn't necessarily mean dependence. Jimmy Akin clearly shows this in his talk. Another general problem with these theories is that there is no historical evidence of a sect of Christianity that espoused the Jesus myth theory. We know quite a bit about ancient heresies from the fathers of the church, either by their refuting them or by also a few original texts. There are no obvious examples in the early church of the heresy that Jesus was just a mythological figure. Okay, so let's get into the different types of mythicism. Following Tim O'Neill in his article on the website Strange Notions, an atheist historian examines the evidence for Jesus, we can divide the various proposals into 4 groups. The first proposal is that Jesus was an amalgam of earlier pagan myths brought together into a mythic figure of a god-man and savior of a kind found in many cults of the time. Here we'll see that they liken Jesus to Horus, Mithra, Dionysus, Krishna, Attis, and many others. This is the stuff of zeitgeist and religulous. Following Jimmy's lead, we will take Horus as a case study to show why this falls apart. I highly recommend John Sorensen's articles on Horus and Mithras, which is also on the website Strange Notions, if you want a thorough examination. The second type thinks that Jesus was a celestial being who existed in a realm just below the lunar sphere and was not considered an earthly being at all until much later. I'm not making this up. This view is proposed by Earl Doherty in his books The Jesus Puzzle and Jesus Neither God Nor Man. His views are based on a now defunct view of Middle Platonism. This view takes its cues from a belief that St. Paul doesn't make references to the earthly Christ. Problem with this is that he actually does, as we'll see later. Another author, Richard Carrier, also follows a form of this in his book On the Historicity of Jesus and Why We Might Have Reason to Doubt. To answer this one, you can see Trent Horn's debate with Richard Carrier. It's quite a wild ride. The third view is that Jesus began as an allegorical symbolic figure of the Messiah who got historicized into an actual person despite the fact that he never really existed. We can see this theory proposed by Robert Price in his book Jesus, a Very Jewish Myth. The main problem with this myth is that Jesus died on the cross. So say what you like about the Jews of the first century, they definitely thought that the Messiah was going to be a victorious leader who would throw off the Roman occupation and usher in a new era of a very earthly Davidic kingdom. St. Paul himself points to this difference of expectation where he says, "We preach Christ crucified, which is a scandal to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles." The fourth and last proposal is that Jesus was not a Jewish preacher at all, but actually someone else, an amalgam of people combined into one figure in the Christian tradition. This myth was supposedly made up by the Romans. One author even proposes that Jesus was Julius Caesar, mixing in Jewish tradition as part of his own cult. This one is so far-fetched and has no evidence in its favor. No credible scholar takes it seriously. Okay, as I said earlier, I would like to take Horus as a case study for these myth types that are then applied to Jesus. Jimmy Akin already dealt with the mother and child statue, a supposed parallel. However, mythicists mention even more parallels. In John Sorensen's article, he sums up his findings in the following way. The claimed parallels between Jesus and Horus contain half-truths, distortions, and flat-out falsehoods. He also mentions that many of these parallels are based on the amateur Gerald Massey's outdated Egyptology that has been subsequently debunked by serious scholars. I'll quickly go through 4 of the most striking parallels. First, Horus was born of a virgin mother. This is false because Horus is the son of Isis and Osiris. True, Isis had to put Osiris back together after he was dismembered by Seth, and also had to provide him with a golden phallus for the deed, but this is hardly a virgin birth. Second is that he was baptized by supposed Anup the Baptizer. Problem here is that there is no record of an Anup the Baptizer in ancient Egyptian mythology. Third, he had 12 disciples. Although in Horus mythology there is evidence for 4, 6 sons of Horus, there are no images of him with 12 disciples. The only thing Macy could come up with is a mural where there are 12 figures, except that Horus is accidentally missing in this depiction. The fourth and last parallel we will address is that Horus was crucified. Here again, there are serious problems. First, we have no historical knowledge that the Egyptians practiced crucifixion, so it's difficult to think that they would have one of their gods crucified. And second, the only evidence for this claim is a mural of Horus with his arms outstretched. But there are no cross and no nails. Many other figures also have outstretched arms, and we wouldn't say that they were crucified. In sum, there is practically no basis to uphold the many parallelisms between Horus and Jesus. Therefore, Jesus could not have been a repackaged Horus. And as we have done with Horus, one can do with the other possible mythological figures proposed, such as Mithra. There's even reason to believe that this myth doesn't even predate Christianity. Or Dionysus, Attis, and Krishna. Now we're going to turn to the argument from silence. It is true that no non-Christian contemporary of Jesus writes about him, while we have contemporary evidence for other ancient figures such as Julius Caesar. This argument doesn't work though, because Jesus wasn't an emperor. He was a Jewish preacher from the backwater part of the Roman Empire, Palestine. We should compare him to others of the same type. And surprise, surprise, we have no contemporary reference to any of them either. Not even Josephus, a Jewish historian, whom we'll see shortly, was mentioned by his contemporaries, or even the next generation for that matter. We only have his writings. We will see that Jesus was mentioned by the next generation, and even his generation, considering Matthew and John were disciples. Some mythicists point to a whole slew of authors who should have mentioned Jesus, if he were a historical figure. The problem with these lists is that many of these authors really wrote nothing that has to do with first century Palestine, or especially first century Palestine preachers. Thus, it would be strange to mention Jesus if you were writing about nature, like Pliny the Older, or poetry, like Lucanus. And wait, the guy who did talk about first century Palestine, Josephus, actually does speak about Jesus, twice, as we'll see later. So, no clear case can be made that a supposed silence about Jesus can show that he didn't exist. Now that we've critiqued the pro-mythicism arguments, we will show that there is good historical evidence for Jesus of Nazareth. We will first see non-Christian sources, and second, Christian ones. Our first source will be Publius Cornelius Tacitus, who lived around the years 56 to 120 AD. He's considered one of, if not the greatest of Roman historians. It's within his work The Annals, written around 115 AD, in Book 15, Chapter 44, where we see a clear reference to a historical Christ. It reads thus: Christus, the founder of the name, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius, by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate, and the pernicious superstition was checked for a moment, only to break out once more, not merely in Judea, the home of the disease, but in the capital itself, where all things horrible or shameful in the world collect and find a vogue. This quote clearly refers to the historical Christ, who was put to death by Pontius Pilate in Judea. It's written in the context of the Great Fire of Rome and the subsequent blaming and persecutions of the Christians. So there we go. We have our first independent source, Tacitus. Wait a second, the skeptic might say. Can we really trust this passage? It might have been placed there by a Christian scribe. It's true that we do not have the original text of Tacitus, as we don't have of any ancient writer. Nevertheless, this objection is easily refuted by looking at the tone of the quote in question. A Christian would never insert such a negative take on Christianity, calling it a pernicious superstition. Among most scholars, the passage is accepted as authentic. As John Meyer concludes, despite some feeble attempts to show that this text is a Christian interpolation in Tacitus, the passage is obviously genuine. But wait, maybe Tacitus only relied on hearsay. He used the name Christus and not Jesus, which would be his Roman legal name. Sed contra, Tacitus is known to have been very scrupulous about his histories. We know that he checked his sources and even had access to imperial archives such as the Acta Senatus, which he cites twice in his works, and the imperial libraries. As far as the name goes, in the book The Jesus Legend by Paul Eddy and Gregory Boyd, they say that by the early 2nd century, Christ and Jesus could be used interchangeably, both by Christians and non-Christians. We also know that Tacitus was particularly interested in people who claimed to have risen from the dead, so he would have had an interest in making sure his information was correct. Therefore, we conclude with Eddy and Boyd that all these considerations suggest Tacitus is an independent and thus important non-Christian source about Jesus. Okay, let's head to the Holy Land. Josephus. Josephus lived around 37 to 100 AD and was the foremost Jewish historian of antiquity. He wrote many books, but in his Antiquity of the Jews, he mentions Jesus twice. once in chapter 18, the so-called Testimonium Flavianum, and once in chapter 20. There's a lot of controversy surrounding the first text. Even Christian apologists like Trent Horn and myself accept that there's likely interpolations of Christians to the original text. In order not to get too far into the weeds, we'll focus to the less controversial and shorter passage in chapter 20. It goes like this. So he, Ananus, assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James. This passage is about the death of James, called the brother of the Lord in Acts, where Luke himself recounts James's martyrdom. Ananus was subsequently deposed for this illegal sentence. So there you go. We have another non-Christian source that clearly references Christ. Wait right there. This could be another interpolation of a Christian. Okay, though it is true that the manuscript tradition for this text isn't as good as Tacitus, namely we don't have as many manuscripts, all of them contain this passage. There's really nothing particularly positive about Jesus in this passage, which is more of an offhand remark to clarify which Jesus Josephus was talking about. This is necessary since he talks about another 15 other Jesuses throughout his book. Jesus was a popular name at the time. The text is centered on the deposition of Ananus, not Jesus, plus James is called the brother of Jesus and not the brother of the Lord, as in other Christian documents. In this passage, Jesus is also referred to as the so-called Christ, which would make sense for Josephus, who didn't believe Jesus to be the Messiah, also including the Roman audience who knew Jesus as Christ, as we saw in Tacitus. Okay, so we have at least two solid ancient non-Christian sources that clearly refer to the historical Christ, Tacitus and Josephus. Now let's turn to the Christian sources. The first thing to keep in mind is that these are also good sources of history. Some people seem to only want to accept non-Christian sources as unbiased. However, all sources are biased to one extent or another. We should not place the bar for historical fact higher for the Gospels than we do for any other ancient document. They all get the same treatment. The main sources for the existence of Jesus and the details of his life are obviously the Gospels. However, here I'll send you again to Jimmy Akin's video if you can trust the Gospels. There he shows that yes, we can, and for very good reasons. Though the Gospels give us the most details about Christ's life, St. Paul is the earliest witness to Jesus that we have. It actually might come as a surprise, but he wrote significantly earlier than the commonly accepted earliest Gospel, Mark. There is a general scholarly agreement that Paul was the author of at least 7, though we would say more, of the New Testament letters under his name. His first letter, to the Thessalonians, has been dated as early as only 20 years after Christ's death and resurrection. Though many mythicists claim that there is an embarrassing silence in Paul when it comes to reference to the historical Jesus, this just isn't the case. Though it is true that there are not many references to Christ's life, there are quite a few and important ones. The fact that he didn't mention more is not an embarrassment when we understand what Paul was doing. First, I would like to list off the places where Paul speaks about the historical Jesus. First, Jesus had a mother and lived by the Torah. But when the set time had fully come, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law. Galatians 4:4. Second, Jesus had David as an ancestor. The gospel he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures regarding his son, as to his earthly life, was a descendant of David. Romans 1:3. Third, that the members of the Jewish community killed Jesus. Those churches suffered from the Jews who killed the Lord Jesus and the prophets and also drove us out. Thessalonians 2:13. And fourth, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and folly to the Gentiles. 1 Corinthians 1:23. And fifth, that Jesus died and was buried, rose on the third day, and appeared to several witnesses, including Paul himself, as you can see in 1 Corinthians 15:3-8. As we can see, Paul gives us the basics, and we shouldn't expect necessarily anything else. He's not writing Gospels, but letters and addressing particular theological, moral, and disciplinary issues that come up in the different churches. Many other early texts in and outside the Bible don't mention many details of Christ's life. Some examples are the letters of John 1-3, Revelation, Ignatius of Antioch, Barnabas, etc. Even Acts, whose author was St. Luke, who obviously knew a lot about the earthly Jesus, as we can see from his gospel, doesn't make that many mentions of Jesus' life. One has to take into consideration the literary genre of Paul's letters. But where did Paul get his information? He wasn't an eyewitness of the events of Jesus' life. Some authors, such as Richard Carrier, claimed that he only got his information from revelation, that Paul believed in a celestial Messiah myth that got subsequently historicized by accident. Though the mythicists propose various quotes where Paul mentions his receiving revelation, this doesn't mean that he never had contact with other Christians before him, who were eyewitnesses of Jesus' life. The most famous of these is when Paul went to Jerusalem, as he relates in Galatians 1:18-20. Then, after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to get acquainted with Cephas, aka Peter, and stayed with him 15 days. I saw none of the other apostles, only James, the Lord's brother. I assure you before God that what I am writing to you is no lie. Plainly, Paul met Jesus' relative James. You'd think that James would know if he were related to some mythical Messiah who lived in the third heaven, as Richard Carey proposes. But Paul also refers to the fact that he knew others who were in Christ before me, Romans 16:7. He didn't just invent the whole thing out of thin air. If we look at Acts, we can also see who might be one of these people, namely Barnabas, who accompanied him in his first missionary journey. He even mentions that in passing when he says that he received from others. For what I've received, I pass on to you, 1 Corinthians 15. So besides the Gospels, we have another early Christian source, Paul, who clearly refers to Jesus' historical and earthly life. Okay, I know that's been a lot to take in. So before we see some good sources to go deeper in the topic, I would like to wrap up with an overview of what we've seen so far. First, we saw the importance of a historical Jesus for Christianity due to its historical claims as seen in the Creed, namely Jesus' birth, death, and resurrection. Second, what Jesus mythicism means and its rise to the public eye thanks to the internet and documentaries like Zeitgeist and Religulous. And third, that no serious historian of repute accepts this fringe theory. With this preliminary work done, in the first main part we took a deep dive into the different myth theories and examined Horace as a case study. Then we showed how an argument from a supposed silence of Jesus' contemporaries falls apart. In the second main part, we saw non-Christian sources that attest to the historical Christ, namely Tacitus in his Annals and Josephus in his Jewish Antiquities. And finally, for the Christian sources, we saw that St. Paul clearly refers to the basics of Jesus' earthly life. Okay, now let's see some sources for further study. Since Jesus' mythicism is more of an internet phenomenon, I will propose first that we go there for the rebuttal. So please see Jimmy Akin's video on the topic in this virtual apologetics conference, but then you can check out many articles on Catholic.com, Strange Notions, and Word on Fire. But if you want to go even deeper, there are some books that can help you. From a Catholic general treatment of the historicity of Jesus, I really recommend Brant Petree's The Case for Jesus, the Biblical and Historical Evidence for Christ. But you can also find good points, and Jesus mythicism in particular, in Trent Horn's Counterfeit Christs, Finding the Real Jesus Among Impostors. For a Protestant view on the topic, I recommend the very thorough Jesus Outside the New Testament, An Introduction to the Ancient Evidence by Robert E. Van Voorst, and also The Jesus Legend, A Case for the Historical Reliability of the Synoptic Jesus Tradition by Paul R. Eddy and Gregory A. Boyd. There's also an atheist defense for the minimal historical Jesus by the well-known New Testament skeptical scholar Bart Ehrman, titled Did Jesus Exist? The Historical Arguments for Jesus of Nazareth. Now, I don't agree with everything he says, obviously, but if you want a source that the skeptics consider impartial, I recommend Bart. So there you go. We have solid evidence for the historical Jesus, who, as we know as Christians, is not contained by the past, but lives on in heaven, and by the grace of the sacraments, we can even receive him in our hearts in the Eucharist. God bless you all.